And I think it's time to start. I hope that people who join us will catch up. Welcome to Cypress workshop, covering the basics of end-to-end testing with me, Gleb Bakhmutov. If you haven't cloned this repository, I suggest you do that. These are the instructions right here. All we'll need is Node, at least Node 12, and that should be it. Everything we're going to do is inside this repository. Everything I'm about to show and tell you is in this repository, including the slides, the code, the answers to every exercise. So this is a good repo. Inside the contents, you will see the slides I'm about to start showing. So for example, if you look at the intro slides, the markdown is right here, so you can follow along by reading the markdown, or you can open the slides by clicking on a link. This is how it shows up when it's rendered. So this workshop will cover everything you need to start using Cypress day to day. Okay, completely framework agnostic. Doesn't matter if you're using Angular, React, Vue, Vanilla JS, static side, server side render. It will be the same skills for every technology. I'm Gleb Bakhmutov. I recently have left Cypress, but I worked there for 4 years. And before that, I used Cypress for a year. And at my new job, I'm using Cypress 100%. So I have a lot of experience of working on Cypress, using it, solving people's problems. You can find everything that I've done at gleb.dev. If you have questions, this workshop is unique because you have direct access to me. So ask your questions. I keep an eye on Zoom chat and Zoom Q&A. Okay, so we have a very small number of people, so feel free to ask as many questions as possible. I've written a lot of blog posts about Cypress that you can find, and I also have almost 100 videos showing Cypress in little tips and tricks that you can find on my YouTube channel. Okay, so we're gonna cover the basics, but we're gonna cover a lot. We have 2 days, okay, which means that we are going to have 2 hours today, and we'll cover how to install Cypress, how to do the basic tests, how Cypress scaffolds files. We'll talk about the application-specific things like how do we reset the data before end-to-end tests. After that, we'll see how to control the network, right? End-to-end tests with a backend should be able to spy and stop network requests, and it's built into Cypress. We'll see how to use data fixtures so that we can stop a network request saying, just respond with a JSON file. I think this probably will happen tomorrow, but we'll be able to run Cypress end-to-end test on CI. And I can show how to run it on Circle and GitHub Actions. My suggestion, if you clone and fork repository, that you repeat tomorrow actions by actually running tests on GitHub Actions with me. I'm going to finish with 2 topics that I would say are more advanced, right? We'll talk about how to make sure that the tests are not flaky, which is a huge problem in many end-to-end tests. And that's why many people actually give up on running end-to-end tests, because they write a test, it works sometimes, but after a while it starts failing. On CI, you try running it locally, sometimes it passes, sometimes it doesn't pass. So we'll talk about how to minimize amount of flake without adding hard-coded weights everywhere. And another topic that many people will ask, that we'll cover tomorrow at the end, how to write custom commands so that it can abstract common actions on the page. So we don't have to hard code the same code again and again. Okay, and as I said, this is a unique opportunity. If you have any difficulty, right, during this workshop, you can ask me a question and I'll try my best to answer it. As I said, we will have 4 hours total over 2 days. So 2 hours today, 2 hours tomorrow at the same time. We'll take a 5-minute break after 1 hour because we need it. Now, usually I do this workshop in face-to-face, right? But unfortunately, this one is virtual, so this advice doesn't apply. But ask me instead. The way I like to do workshops, and I've done this workshop probably 10 times by now, is that I will code the solution to the problem. I will explain the topic, I'll code the solution. You can code along, right? We can work together by you coding, the same thing as I'm doing. Okay. And after that, there'll be more exercises for each part, for each section. And in this case, I'll pause. I'll have a problem on the screen. And I suggest that you code the solution and ask me questions if you get stuck. I'll give you plenty of time, but I want everyone to try writing tests because that's the most important thing. As soon as you try writing tests, that's where you learn. And I'll help you so that you actually get through all the exercises. This repository, and I'll keep pasting the repo URL, has everything that I'm showing, right? All the exercises, right? And all the answers will be there. And the exercises will cover, all the tests that we'll write is just a small part, probably less than half of all the exercises that are available in this repository. So if you get through what I'm showing very quickly, keep doing more tests because there are more examples there that you can test. So you can cover a lot more than what we have time to cover, right? And if you struggle with a test, don't worry. Ask me a question. We'll solve it. And then during this evening, during the day tomorrow, you can continue working for exercises to cover them all, just to practice. Okay, as I said, the repository is there. You need at least Node 12 to run Cypress, which is the current version of Node. The way I've done this in my repository, let me just bump the screen size. So this is the repository. If you look at all the files, we have package and package logs. So I will install everything using npm, right? Which should install Cypress and dependencies for the application that's in this repository, right? So I suggest that everyone does npm install right now from the terminal. Correct. So do npm install if you haven't done it already, because we need that application running locally. Okay, so I assume everyone has done it. So the repo is organized like this. We have to do MVC. That's the whole application. So if I open my code editor, right? So, and I'm using VS Code, it doesn't really matter what you use. Okay, I'm gonna bump the sizes so you can clearly see what's going on. Let me know if the contrast is bad or if I should switch the color theme. I think this is pretty high contrast, so you can see everything. So what do I have here? I have, let me just collapse everything. The application is in to-do MVC folder by itself, right? Then we have other files, we have the slides, we have Cypress test, I have Circle CI files, and I have GitHub Action CI files. Okay. Inside Cypress folder, there is integration. That folder contains all our end-to-end test files, or as they are also called specs. And each spec is inside subfolder. So we're gonna work in sections, in chapters, 01, 02, right? And each spec file inside integration is there, right? So we're gonna work with spec files first, starting in this subfolder, then starting in this subfolder, okay, and so on. So we'll get through them one by one. So let me go here. And while we actually test the application will be running. Okay, so I want everyone to start the application. Okay, so what we can do, you don't even have to switch to the MVC application. It should work like this. So let me move this a little bit. If you execute npm start, right, then you should see something like this, where you can see the JSON server is, serving the application. Okay. So you should do npm start, and if everything is working correctly, then we should be able to see localhost 3000. Let me bump this a little. This is what you should see locally. At port 3000, there is an app, right? The app has a couple of to-dos. You can mark them completed. So all we had to do, npm install, npm start. You should be able to delete apps, to-dos. And if you reload, it should stay there. Okay. So this is our application. It's running locally. It accesses just local server. We're going to keep that application running for the entire 2 hours today. Okay, it's a Vue app, doesn't really matter. I'm not going to install Vue DevTools, but you can. The cool thing is that this is inside the browser. If I open my DevTools and I click at the network, right, you should see something like this if you look at XHRs, at AJAX requests. So when you open the app, okay, and reload it, look, every time you open it, it makes a request. And if you look at headers, it's a GET request to local resource / to-dos. Okay, just application JSON request to fetch all the to-dos, and the server returns the to-dos you just added. So it's just a list, and each to-do has completed, flag, some kind of random ID, and the title, and when application is showing up. If you add new to-do, let's say, add test, click enter, then the application is posting a new resource, right, to the backend, and it's sending, what does it send? It's sending completed false, random ID, and the title that we just entered. Okay. If we, for example, mark to do completed, there are no new requests. Okay. So our application is not fully implemented. It doesn't update the status. I should probably implement it. But if you delete something, right, it sends a delete to-dos and ID. So we have a typical REST API. The front end sends REST HTTP requests, and it fetches them. Okay. Everything we have is inside to do MVC folder for the app. If we look at index.html, not this one, to do MVC. And let me just collapse everything. We have HTML, we have the body, we have our to-do app and the footer, and all the vendor files. If you look at the to-do app, we have a header, we have a title, we have an input box with class new to do, and then all the to-dos, right, are rendered by View. So it just iterates through the list of to-dos and shows them on the page. So kind of single page application, nothing really, I would say, unique. You can code the same application in every language. In fact, this came from todoinvc.com, so it's pretty standard implementation. Okay, the code is inside todoinvc app.js, so I can take a look at this code. Just a single file. I can see there is some random ID where we generate the random ID for each new to do. We have the store, the application itself. Okay. Question for the audience, right? And for everyone attending the workshop. And if you just joined us, make sure you have cloned, right, the application. You did the installation and you start the app. Okay, so what happens when you add new to do, right? I showed that it does a post request, right? So this is how it gets to the server. You should look at the repo to see where it is stored, okay? Because everything is inside to todoinvc folder. You can look around and find this modified data JSON file, right? If you look at that, it's just a JSON file. It has a to-dos property, and it's an array. And it's a JSON array that stores every to-do that we have on the server, including ID, completed, and the title. Okay, and if we remove something ourselves and reload the app, right? Let's see if it's removed and left. Yeah. So that file is where the backend app is storing all the data, just a JSON plain file. Okay. So on startup, if we reload the page, right, when the application just starts, notice how it quickly says loading date. It's kind of blinking, but it does a request and fetches from the backend the JSON file. If you look at the structure, we have a UI, the page, right, the DOM. On the page, there is a view with data store, and data store synchronizes itself with REST API calls. Okay. Now, if you want to go into detail how the application is, has been created, I have a longish blog post that explains it in detail and how you can test everything in isolation. The backend API, the data store, and the UI. We don't care about this just yet, right? So we just finished talking about the setup, right? The introduction. Okay. So now I will start the second section, right? We will see how we actually start a new Cypress testing project. Okay. So we have application running. We'll be able to write the first test. We'll see how Cypress documentation works and so on. Okay. So here's what I want everyone to do, right? I want to make a new folder. So my application is running. I'll just create a new folder. So I'm going to post this here. Okay. So my application is running. I'll have another, right? Here. I have another terminal. So I'm going to go to temporary folder and I will create a folder example. I'll switch to that example. So right now it's empty folder. I'm going to initialize an empty npm package JSON, right? So this will create package JSON locally. So it's npm init. Now you don't have to have it to run Cypress, but I strongly advise you to actually have a package JSON so that you record the version of Cypress you're using, so you're not accidentally using global tool. Okay, and then I'll say npm install dev dependency Cypress. Now you can use yarn -d Cypress, right? But this is local installation of Cypress. So Cypress is an npm package that downloads a binary we built for each operating system. Notice that because I already have it downloaded once, it skips the download, so it is much faster. So right now, what do we have here? We have no files, just npm install. Okay. So I need to open Cypress. I want to work with it interactively on my local machine. So I can use a couple methods depending on the version of Node, but every modern version of Node has npx included. So this is my preferred way of opening Cypress. Okay. Now, on my local machine, unfortunately, it's a new MacBook. It takes a while to actually for it to ask each browser. So Cypress tries to find all installed browsers. So that's why I have like extra 10-second delay. Usually it's faster. But the first time you start Cypress, this is what you should see. It notices that this is a new project in a new folder, right? So it scaffolded a couple of files for me. Okay, so it kind of shows what is scaffolded, right? It has a link to writing your first test, right? But it also creates a bunch of integration tests, right? And the first thing I want to point out is that Cypress comes with Electron browser, which is a Chrome version. But it also looked around on my machine and found these installed browsers already. All right, so Cypress can work with Electron, Chrome, Firefox, Brave, the new Microsoft Edge browser. So I can pick the browser. I usually just leave it at Electron unless I have a good reason, because then I don't have to kind of see which browser I'm running in. And I can click on any example and it will start running. Okay. So this is Cypress in action. Okay. All these scaffolded spec files, they show Cypress doing different things, like actions would be, clicking on the buttons, typing, scrolling, right? All those commands are shown right here. I can see how Cypress can write and run assertions, explicit, implicit, and so on. Now, let me switch to this folder and open this code there. Example. Don't trust it. Okay. So when Cypress started for the first time, it scaffolded this file, Cypress JSON. It's a JSON file with all Cypress global settings. It also created Cypress folder, where it has 4 subfolders. Fixtures are all the files that you want to use as fixtures, like basic test data. Integration, that's where all those specs that I see right here, right, that were created. For example, those assertions, this is the typical Cypress spec, right? Has context, so a group of tests inside the context, has a visit, right? So going to the page that Cypress serves. And then these are typical assertions like should have text, should have HTML, should match, should be visible. Okay. So you can click on any of the specs and see Cypress in action. Okay. There is even a little to-do example, but that's Cypress to-do example. Okay. Now we're not going to use it. Okay, but this is typical Cypress scaffolding procedure. Okay. Now I used npx Cypress open. You can also put a couple of aliases in your package JSON that you scaffold. I usually have Cypress open, which is interactive mode, and Cypress Run, which is non-interactive headless mode. That's what you would use on CI. Okay, this is the scaffolding explanation of the files. Now I said integration, that's where all the test files live by default. You can also put additional commands and additional plugins into Cypress plugins and support. We're not going to cover a thing them today, probably just support file later on. So these are just two utility folders where you can use to extend Cypress. But for now, we'll just work inside the integration and maybe a little bit inside the fixtures folder. Okay. Now, what does look interesting to me here? I can stop this. I can run all these files together. Okay. So I can, for example, either limit myself by using a part of file name, or I can run all currently visible files together just to see everything Cypress can do. What this means, it's literally concatenate all the spec files into one huge mega spec file and run all the tests together. So if you want to see everything Cypress can do, right, all the examples, it's right here. Notice Cypress is pretty fast, I think, right? It never has to wait longer than necessary. If it clicks on a button, as soon as the button is clickable, it clicks on it. Right? So usually tests execute pretty quickly, I want to say. Taking screenshots in this case, navigation, controlling the network, spying, stubbing, all sorts of things. So if you're just starting, I think it's a good idea to look at examples, see, get a feeling for what Cypress can do. Okay. If you scaffold a couple of projects, you probably don't want those examples. I have a little utility where you can use to quickly scaffold new projects, so you don't create those things. You just create, a single spec and so on. You can even include, scaffold bare minimum, Cypress JSON plus a single empty spec file. By the way, everything that the scaffold does comes from this repository, Cypress example kitchen sink. Okay, and beside that, it's testing an explanation of all commands like I don't know, like click. Right, all those examples are there at example Cypress. Let me just place it here. So you don't have to scaffold anything to just take a look at Cypress tests and commands. You can look at the repository yourself first. And I have a personal project of mine called Cypress Examples, which takes the same tests and extends them. So these examples actually go beyond example.cypress.io. And it also has a bunch of recipes, which are more complicated examples that people used to ask me again and again. How do you do that? How do you do that? And so all of them are tested before they get deployed. So I would say, including the search, it's pretty good idea to search for anything you're trying to do at my example site first. Let's say click, right? Shows all the different ways you can click. Okay. So let's go together, right? This is our opportunity. We have our application running right here. Here's our opportunity to test it. Okay. So I'm gonna stop all the tests. I'm not interested in those spec files, so I'm gonna delete them. Okay. And instead, let's add a spec.js. So I scaffolded new project, and I will write my first test. Okay. So notice Cypress watching the integration folder, so it noticed that all the spec files are gone. Okay. So here's my first test. I want to make sure that the application loads, so I'm going to put it right here. Remember, my app is running at localhost 3000, so I'm just going to say site visit 3000. Visit is the Cypress command for visiting an URL. Okay. So what do we see here? We see in the browser the Cypress controls. We see localhost 3000, the URL that we just visited or visiting on the right. So this is actual iframe website, right? I can, use it. It's fully functioning, right? Because this is a browser. Because it's a browser, I can open DevTools. I can inspect everything, right? I can interact with the app. Okay, so if this is the app, on the left is the Cypress command log. Okay, so it just shows the name of the test, loads, and the test body are all the commands that we have written here. In this case, the visit. Okay. So make sure, if you don't see it, make sure you started the app locally. Okay, so first things first, what happens if a server is not responding or is unreachable? Okay, so our server is running here. I'm going to close it for a second. And if I rerun Cypress, okay, it says, well, sorry, localhost 3000 doesn't respond. So this little test, right here, is already a full end-to-end test, because we start a real browser. It tried to load the URL, the server did not respond. If a page did not finish loading, if it threw an error, if there was an exception, Cypress would fail the test. Right? So this is actual, mini test, but it's a full functioning end-to-end test. Can the user load your page, right here? Okay, by the way, so notice that in this stack, right, I can go directly to the command that just failed. Okay, so I'm going to start it back. Okay, so I know, I mentioned this. Okay, now, right now, if you're just coding, you have no idea what this does, right? In Cypress, everything is chained or this global variable side, but notice there are no types, so I can do this, and the only way I know that this is not a function is by running it. It would be nice to actually know what I'm doing. So here's what you can do. There is a special triple comment. Okay, but I'm going to pass right here. If you add it to the top of a spec file, okay, everything will become magical, right? In a modern code editor. Cypress includes the TypeScript definition for its global SCI object. So by saying, hey, load the reference types from npm module Cypress that you install as a dev dependency, all of a sudden the global variables will have Intellisense. Right? Every known command, which should be visit, will have Intellisense, right? Says, oh, param, the URL. Oh, here I can pass some options. Okay, I'll pass some options. Okay. So it's very important, even if you're using JavaScript, which is what I'm doing, right? I didn't install anything else. Add this comment line, and all of a sudden you will know what you're doing. Okay. Even better, you can add TS check. Okay. So even in a JavaScript project, no TypeScript, nothing. But usually VS Code, WebStorms, right? They respect those comments. And so now if you misspell visit again, notice what it says. Did you mean visit? Right? It even says, where it's declared. Yeah, visit, of course. Okay. So configuring Intellisense is super important right away. Okay. And by the way, not only the commands, right, are there, but if we, for example, get, let's say, new to do, right, all the assertions, right, like should be, let's say, visible. All these assertions also have their own Intellisense. Notice that this is a specific explanation for what visible, is and how it works. Okay, I showed this documentation, right? If you're starting with Cypress, right, you don't have to know everything. You don't even need 10 commands. I think 3 commands, like we'll start with, is enough for you to write useful tests. But you need to learn where to learn more, or how to find out more information. So once you have Intellisense, right, notice that every command has a C attribute. Okay, so the get has, its documentation, but also has the get. The should and assertion, right, have documentation. So if you, for example, look at visit and you click on this visit, okay, it goes to Cypress documentation. The Cypress documentation is something that the Cypress team has invested a lot of time, literally. During my 4 years there, we probably spent at least 25% of everyone's time updating and writing documentation, right? So every command like visit, and these are all commands the Cypress knows, get, click, title, like go, and so on, get cookies, invoke. Every command is documented the same way, and you can kind of see it's on the right. You have the syntax that explains the arguments and what each parameter means and how to use it, right? You have examples, right? So for example, site visit, you can open a URL or you can open a local file, right? You have examples of different options, and then all like details. For example, redirects. If you're visiting a URL and it redirects somewhere else, Cypress will follow that redirect. Okay, the web server has to respond, and we'll look at base URL later. Okay, at the end there are rules. Okay, and the rules say this command will fail, for example, if the server responds with something else. If it's not text HTML or text plain, site visit will fail. Okay, remember we failed to even visit the site when I turned the server off, right? If at the end of the day site visit doesn't get 200 from the server, it will fail automatically, right? So a lot of commands have those built checks or built-in assertions, so that you don't have to specify things. Okay. Timeouts. If a page keeps loading for a minute and never fires load event, it will fail. Okay. And we also have a history of each command, so that you know if it has changed, which is very important if you're trying to upgrade Cypress from major to major version. And also, if you're starting with Cypress and you learned how site visit works, and then you want to extend your knowledge, right? At the end of each command, we have see also that link related commands. For example, reload, right? You enter a couple to-dos, you want to reload the page to make sure the new to-dos are there. And a couple of recipes and big examples. So each command is like this. Get, which is finds elements. Same thing, usage, arguments, examples, rules, history, and related commands. Okay. Oh, and by the way, I should have fixed this broken link, but the most useful thing, at least at first, I would suggest, is this documentation search. Okay. So if you're interested how site click works, right, you can see it right here, right, and additional information. If you're interested how, let's say, network works, find it. Continuous integration, right, guides. Maybe you're interested in visual testing. Maybe you're interested in accessibility. Okay, use the search. It's configured very well. It scrapes everything. So I would suggest you try finding things. One other thing, frequently asked questions are right here. So you have guides, which are big concepts, API, which are all commands and utilities and assertions, plugins. Don't worry about that, but that's how you would extend Cypress with additional things. Examples we'll skip for now. And all the questions that you might have about Cypress, how to test specific things are here. Okay. I'm gonna switch this, and I'm gonna. So to finish this second chapter, make sure you configure Intellisense for your Cypress tests. Even inside JavaScript, you can add the special comment. And now it will become so much easier to write everything. Okay. And learn what documentation is, because it will answer all your questions. It has answers, right? That I can guarantee. For the first couple months, you probably will have all the answers right there. Okay, so let me go to the next section. Okay, so we have our little example right here, right? But let's actually write meaningful tests. So I'm gonna close this code editor, I'm gonna close this Cypress, okay? And I will go back to my Cypress workshop basics. Okay, so I'm back in a repository. Okay, and I want to make sure that we can add items, we can run Cypress, and the explanation, the difference between running Cypress like I've done using Cypress Open versus Cypress Run. Okay, so here's what I want everyone to do. I want you to open Cypress from the workshop repository. So if you do npm run, you will see that there are a bunch of commands. We want to do npm run site open. Okay, or do npx Cypress open, or do yarn Cypress open. But once it comes up, right, we want to do the following. We want to open this spec file. Okay, so 0.1 basic. So if you open it, it runs, it visits localhost 3000, right? I can see the visit, right? I can see that it found new to do. So check this out. Let's look at this spec file. Okay, so we have a couple of commands in this file. We have visit, we have get, right, which is CSS selector. So it finds right now an element with class new to do. We're finding footer, which is the name of element. And then we have another command called contains, which takes text to find, right? So any element that contains to do this app. So we can see that the visit, get footer, they all work, and this element contains, right, failed. This command site contains failed, right? So it's showing in red, right? The test shows it has failed. Okay, so our test is almost correct, but this command fails. Okay, so the first question I want to pose to you is like, how do you even find documentation for site contains? Well, I would go to docs, I would go to API, command, and then find the contains. So this is documentation, right, for the command. Okay, so I can see how to use it, right? I can see, oh, I can do content, or I can do selector and a content. Okay, so in this case, we have a selector. So we're looking for H1 element on a page that contains text to do's app. Okay. But command is failing. So let's see why. Let's open the DevTools. Okay. And we are in an elements tab, so we can use this element finder. So this is the element we probably want to find. This is H1. But notice it doesn't have to-do's app. It only has to-do's. So our test really should be this. By the way, notice when you're using Cypress Open, Cypress is watching your files, right? So let me show this. All right. So if I have my Cypress on one side and my code editor on another, and I say to-dos, Cypress automatically reruns the test, right? Which is something I do all the time. Keep Cypress testing on one side while I'm working on a feature on another, and just keep running all the tests. Okay, so we fixed the test, right? What else? Right. Notice that the test did not fail right away, which is kind of a big thing, right? So if the test is failing, right? If we say this, right? Notice the test is not failing right away. There is a blue spinner, and it spends 4 seconds trying to find an element H1 that contains to-dos. Because maybe my application adds exclamation point after 2 seconds. Maybe while it's loading, it shows to-dos, and when it's done loading, it says to-dos exclamation point. And Cypress is framework agnostic, so it doesn't know when your application is done loading. So instead, it says, okay, just keep trying finding an element. And only when you time out, then really fail the test. Okay. Now, if you look at documentation, right, and you look at options, right, arguments, right, you can see options like matching case, right, log. What does log do? Right, we can say log false. Right, in this case, it's not going to appear in this command log. When it fails, then the assertion appears. Right, what we do want to log it, but we probably want to run it for maybe a different amount of time. So maybe we want to run it for a long time. So it keeps searching and searching and searching. So Cypress has this retries, and we'll talk about retries tomorrow. But notice, maybe your application will update eventually. Maybe, you know, you expect the user to come here and say to-dos and exclamation. And notice the test just passed. As soon as Cypress retried one more time, notice there's H1 with to-dos exclamation point. That's what it was looking for, right? So we can vary how long a command tries to succeed by changing the timeout. Okay. So Cypress Open, that's what we use to open Cypress. That's what watching files, you know, that's how you would use it day to day. There is a second command called Cypress Run, right? This is what you would do to run Cypress on CI. So let's try this, right? So I will, and by the way, notice right now it fails. So keep it in mind. I'm going to close this. And instead of npx Cypress Run or Cypress Open, excuse me. So I'm going to say Cypress Run. And first, I'm going to say help. So when you run Cypress, you can do different things. right? Control the browser, control environment variables, run in headed, headless mode, change report and so on. I really want to run just a single spec file because there are a lot of spec files, but I'm not interested in them. So what I will do here, I'll say spec Cypress integration 01 spec, right? Which is what we have here right now. And remember, this will fail. So when I run this, okay, notice Cypress is running, but nothing appears because I'm running in headless mode by default using Electron. And again, on my machine, it's like extra 10 seconds to check every non-existent browser at startup. See how it's running? Excuse me. Okay. So the test just finished. So this is what would you do on CI. And you would say Cypress Run. You probably would not limit this to individual spec. You would just run all the specs, but it tells you like which the search string was, how many specs it found, the browser name. So it's running this spec. It failed. Expected to find content to do exclamation point. Found H1, right? But we selected one, but never did. Great. So you have an error message, but will you be able to actually debug this? Not yet. Notice it actually saves screenshots. So Cypress automatically, when you run it with Cypress Run, when it fails, it takes a screenshot and it puts them in Cypress screenshots and by the name of a folder and the spec, right, and the test name. So this is how Cypress looked at that moment when it was running headlessly and it failed. So you can see command log, you can see visit succeeded. It got the input box, it got the footer, but then it tried to find H1 element with to-dos exclamation point, could never find it, and it failed. So this should give you an idea of what has happened, why it has failed. But also notice that in addition to screenshots, there's also video. So on every platform, Cypress comes with a video recorder built in. You don't have to install anything. Okay, so you can see Cypress videos, name of the spec file, MP4 file. So this is how the browser looked when it ran the test and when it failed. Okay, so make sure you store those test artifacts on CI, like screenshots, videos, in case you have to debug what's going on. Usually I look at the video of a failed run versus successful run. Excuse me. And when something fails, right, you compare it. You can also use Cypress dashboard, which is additional service for storing those things. But make sure you store it on your CI so that you can debug what has happened. Okay, so let me fix the test. So, okay. Okay, so I explained this. So we fixed the test, but here's another thing that I want to ask you, right? So in our test, right here, we kind of said, well, give me the input, element with class new to do. Give me a footer just by element name. I'm not sure that, just saying, give me the text H1 is the best selector, right? So these things, how we getting the elements, how we finding them on the screen are called selectors, okay? And in Cypress documentation, you have a guide, right, for the best practices. Let me go, okay. So we suggest that you use things like, specific data attributes like data side, data test ID, right? And you don't use something that's really, really common like button or CSS classes that I use for styling. Okay, even IDs are not perfect because IDs can change, right? Someone can come in and say, I need to rename this ID because it clashes with another ID that I'm adding. Okay, so we suggest either use the text because text is very obvious. Maybe use data attributes like ARIA label, ARIA role, right? Or specific data attributes that are explicitly added for testing, because then it's like really clear. Hey, if you change this, your test probably will have to change as well. Okay, so this is what I explained. Different commands, how they retry, how you run Cypress in headless mode versus headed, and how it saves screenshots and videos on failure. Okay, so let's take a 5-minute break because I need to get something to drink for my throat now, and then we'll start testing main features of To-Do MVC app, meaning adding items, maybe completing items, organizing our spec files, and so on. So take 5-minute break, and we'll continue in just a second. Okay, I'm back. Let's continue. Reminder, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to post them in a Zoom. I have the Zoom chat open, right? And let's code some tests. First thing, you have to look at your application and decide what are the most important features you want to test for the user. We have to do MVC. So the most important is probably adding, maybe then completing and deleting. Okay, everything else, right? Like editing. I don't have editing here, but maybe it's like additional. Most important thing is to be able to add items one after another, make sure they stay so you can reload and see them. So once we decide what to do, let's test it. Okay, so my to-do MVC is running. And now I want to open in my code editor this spec file, right? From 0 to adding items. And I'm gonna open Cypress as well. Okay, so in this case, I'm gonna, so 0 to demo spec, okay. So I will have Cypress on the bottom of my screen. And okay, I have my first test right here. And I'm gonna click on it, right? And I'm gonna move Cypress to the top. Okay, so we can see both at the same time. Okay. The one note that always tripped for users is that we're not resetting, right? So every time you reload, right, those items are still there. So if you add items, they'll be there. So if you want to remove them, so you have clean slate, you have to delete them manually. Okay, just keep it in mind. Okay, let's see if we can make this test work. The test is called adds to items. Okay, so I'll find it here. Okay, so the first thing I want to do, I want to run just this test, right? So we have a lot of placeholder tests that you can code later, but right now I just want to work on this test. So I'll say only it.only, which is standard Mocha syntax. I want to be focused on this test only. So I need to get the input field. So I can say sci get input. Okay, well, that doesn't work, right? Well, forgot we need to sci visit localhost 3000 first. Okay. Now, here's the trick. When you go to the command log and you hover over each command, usually it shows additional details. For example, here, it highlights the element that it found using get input. Okay, so this is the right field. Does it have a better selector so it's more robust? Because there might be multiple inputs. Okay, in this case, well, it has new class. So I'll just say maybe input with class new to do. Okay, so this is selecting the input box. Now, once I found it, I need to type in, right? Imagine you're a user. So you're saying to the user, go to that URL, find the input box, type, let's say type, write code, and we need to probably click enter. So in Cypress type, this is the enter. Okay, so if we do this, right, we can see that it's working. If we want to continue working with the same element, we can say type write test, and we'll press enter. Okay, so we can see, let me just remove all the items, rerun the test again. So we can see write code, write test have been added. Let's hover over command log. it found the input box, then it typed write code, and notice in this case, Cypress runs right inside the browser, so it noticed that the page has changed. So it took a DOM snapshot before and after the command. So before, you typed into this input box where the red dot is. After, you got a new list item. Okay, and what about the second write test? Before, after. So you can see how the application behaved in response to the command. Okay, if we run it again, well, we have 4 items and so on. Now, we want to sort, but there are 2 items after we're done typing twice. Okay, so if we run this, we need to find the selectors for these list items. Okay, so we can say sci get li should have length 2. Okay, well, we should remove everything, run the test from clean. So these are commands. We've been interacting with the page like a real user. We can see that application fetching initial list of to-dos. We can see the application posting each to-do item. We can see that our get command found 2 elements, and our assertion should have length 2 is in green, so it passed. One other thing is that, let's say you want to see what this element, let's say these items. If you click on a command, it says printed output to your console. So if you open DevTools and you look at the console, right? If you click on the item, it says command get selector. These are the actual item elements that you found. And by the way, notice that these LI items have a better selector, so we want to be more precise. They have class to do. So this is slightly more robust. What about these things like network calls? If you click on them, right, Cypress tells you, okay, your application made a request, which was a post to /to-do. This was the request, right? So it sent the new to-do. And what did the server respond? Oh, it just responded with the same to-do. Okay, so keep this in mind for our future work. Well, so we verified that adding to-dos work, right? What about completing the to-dos? Well, I can go to the first item, click on this checkbox, and it marks it completed. So let's write the test for that. So we have this placeholder test can mark an item as completed. So we have to do the same thing. We have to go visit the URL, right? Add those, couple items. Okay. Now, remember the chaining syntax. We can find the to-do items. There should be 2 of them. Then we want to, for example, take the first item out of the 2. Okay. So found 2 to-do items, then pick just the first one. And now let's open the DevTools and look at what is this item. The markup is input type checkbox class toggle. So we can say first find toggle. Okay. So the interesting thing here is that get works from the top of the page, right? So starts looking at the entire page. Right? So it's like start searching from nothing. If you want to find something inside the element that you're working with, so in this case, get found us 2 items. We use command sci first to pick just the first element out of a two, or however many. Then inside that element, but li to do, right, the first one, we found an element with class toggle. Okay, so again, if we save it, we can hover first, fine. By the way, notice this little thing, not visible because the way this particular to-do MVC renders things, the checkbox is actually hidden. It shows like a little icon on top of it, which if we try to click might be problematic. So let me remove it. Now it works. Okay. So we clicked on this checkbox. So right now we just perform actions. We only had one assertion, right? There should be two items. Every time we act with, on an application, it will do something. So we want to make sure that it does the right thing. We don't want the test to blindly click 10,000 times and then have one assertion at the end. The best end-to-end tests, they do an action, assertion, action, assertion. So almost like stripes. So in this case, once we clicked, right, we want to make sure that the first item is completed. Again, how do we know if it's completed? We're going to open DevTools. We're going to look at the markup. So notice that the first item has class to do, like before, and has new class completed. And the second item doesn't have class completed. So we need to confirm it, that we are completing just the first item and don't complete this item. Okay. So here's how we're going to do this. Again, we're going to grab all the items. We're going to grab the first one and we'll say should have class completed. Now, Cypress comes with everything included, right? It has Mocha test engine. It has all assertion libraries. It has a library for sorting the elements. So it has Chai jQuery in this case for all these assertions like should have class, right? For the first month, you don't have to install anything else. And the assertions are usually written the way you would actually say it in English. Get me the first item. It should have class completed. I don't care if it happens immediately or after 100 milliseconds per second, all the way to the timeout. Okay, what about the second element? So there is no second command, unfortunately. There is just equal, right? And you just give an index starting with 0. So this would be the second element out of previous elements. And in this case, should not have class completed because only the first element will have it and the second should remain as it is. Okay, so I'm going to save it. And now notice what happened, right? The test passed, and if we inspect the command, we can see that yes, the first one, item has class completed, and the second out of the two does not have class completed. And by the way, so very important detail here. Notice that this is positive assertion. Okay. This assertion checks that something has changed in response to this click. Okay. And once you actually check that the application has responded, then you can do what is called a negative assertion. Right. It's very important to first do positive, then negative assertion. Otherwise, if you change it, if you say, well, the second one, this will pass even if you don't click on it, right? Because it will, by default, it will pass. And let's say if I get this. Yeah, still doesn't have. So you're not really testing anything. If you want to confirm that the action works, first, always check that something that you think should have happened in response specifically to that action has really happened, and then whatever else that should not happen. No. Okay. Okay, let's refactor the code. If we look at our tests, we've done a couple things again and again. Right, we're visiting the page. So because we use Mocha engine, we can just move those commands into a common hook. Before each test, we want to visit the page. Okay, so I'm going to run again the test. Okay, so notice those commands are marked clearly before each you want to visit it. What else? Well, we probably don't want to hardcode the URL because sometimes we want to test localhost. By default, when we deploy to staging, we probably want to pass the base URL pointing at staging. If we deploy to production, we want to point at production. So the way you would do that, you would open Cypress JSON file, and you would put the base URL there. Okay. In that case, you don't have to hard code it. You can just say, yeah, you don't have to hard code it anywhere. You would just say, just visit base URL. Okay. So visit just uses base URL. Okay. Remember, this is just JavaScript. We're writing either JavaScript or TypeScript or CoffeeScript when we're using Cypress. So this particular thing, right, like adding items, you can just say const add 2 items. If you need it again and again, you don't want to repeat yourself, right? Then you can say something like this. Enter 2 items and wait to confirm that they really are showing before you move on. So in this case, we can just say add 2 items. Okay, so let me delete the items, save it. Perfect. Simple. Don't repeat yourself, but make sure the test is really readable. You might say, well, I don't want to add 2 items all the time. I probably want to add item and pass it text. Yeah, sure, you can do it. So in this case, you're going to find the input box and type text plus enter. So you can say add item, write code, add item, and you need this. Right? Works the same way. So we're going to remove it. You can refactor your code to be as readable, as reusable, never repeat yourself, yet still be easier to understand what you're trying to do. Deleting an item. Same stuff, right? We can say run this test. We need 2 items, right? We're gonna grab the first one. Now, how do we delete an item? Well, you have to press on this button. What is this button? Let's open DevTools. Let's look at this markup. There is a button destroy. Unfortunately, it's only visible on hover. I think this is exactly what I cannot do by default, but let's see. So find destroy and click on it. And once we do that, how many items should we have? Well, just 1. And we can then check some more, but here's what we will. Okay, let's try it again. Okay, notice it doesn't pass because the click says element is not visible. right? So the error message is always very, very nice, right? In this case, because it becomes visible on hover, let's force it. So when we click on it, we'll say, forget your default checks force true, right? Just make sure you click on it. Okay, so now it deletes, right? So it found 2 items. First, found the destroy element and clicked on it, and again, see, shows before and after, so you understand that it actually deleted the thing. By the way, so let's confirm that we deleted the right item. Okay. So after we've done this, it still contains right tests. Should be visible. So by default, contains already includes should exist. But we're trying to make it stronger, say like, yeah, it should exist in a dump and be visible. Okay. So there's one remaining item after we click destroy, and the right test is the one that remains. So we did not accidentally delete the wrong to-do item. By the way, so we kind of use like right test if we're not deleting the items, if this is a staging server, other test runners are using it, maybe some other users from QA are looking at staging. So I often advise, instead of adding 2 items, right, I usually advise to add a random text. So in this case, let's say, where are we? Like right here, right? I want to say text 1, and let's say example, and then we can use Cypress, which is a big Cypress, right? Which includes not the individual commands, but a Cypress object that includes all utilities that Cypress has globally. And it includes Lodash. So in this case, we can say random method from 1 to let's say 7. Okay. So we'll say add item text 1, and we'll create another item. So we'll say example 1, example 2, and we'll add them. And the one that remains should be text 2. Okay, so this is pretty nice, right? We can say, we can remove this link, right? We can say contains text 1. Okay, we can even say find this item, right? And click on it. So instead of blindly saying, oh, there are no items, instead we'll say add 2 random items deleted. And then we can verify that the first one should not exist. Perfect. So now we're not even changing anything, but we can see how the first item was destroyed, right? And the second one still remains. So by using random titles for items, we can avoid clearing the data, which works really well in an environment where you cannot clear the data. Okay, one other thing, we kind of were running things at 600 by 800. We can change the viewport and, for example, see if our application works on a different viewport. Let's say viewport. And you can pass the, let's say, iPhone resolution, or you can say, let's say, I don't know, how does our app look at width of 300 by height of 600, for example. Okay, so this is how it still works, right? It still fits everything. We can also specify viewport as usually iPhone or like one of these settings, let's say iPhone 8. So they're pre-built resolutions. You can also even specify it right here in per test settings. So viewport height, I don't know, let's say 500 with 1000. Okay. So make sure you run end-to-end tests at different resolutions, because it's not enough for you to make sure the layout works at desktop. You also want to make sure that it works on mobile device and the buttons are not smooth, nothing is covering, preventing the user from clicking. And it's very easy to actually control this in Cypress. Okay, one other thing, I'm going to skip this one. You can look at this yourself. So here's the thing. You can write end-to-end tests using Cypress, right? This is end-to-end test. It visits the URL, right? It works in a real browser. So you're not testing a piece of code or a component. You're testing the whole site, the whole application. Cypress can also run unit tests for you, right? So you say add, A, B, A plus B. So you can do that. And you can say, let's remove this. You can say it adds. So you can say expect add 2, 3 to equal 5. Perfect. You can definitely do that. You can import, this add from our files, right? So you can say either from your code, right, or from application code. So here you can say import add from add. Works the same way. So the unit tests are much smaller. They don't have a UI. So usually they say like you arrange your code, you act, right, by adding two numbers, and then you assert something, just like we did. End-to-end tests are slightly larger, right? Our tests where we're adding a couple items, finding buttons, clicking, verifying, and usually they go through a user story. They don't test a piece of code, they test how the user can interact with the site. And instead of saying arrange, act in a single assertion like unit test, you should just do command assertion, command assertion, command assertion. Okay. And once the test is super big, sometimes it passes way too quickly. Right? Let's say here. This kind of goes right under 1 second. You can still kind of understand, right? And you can hover over each command to see what has happened. But even better is to use pause command. So for example, here, I can say pause. So it went all the way up to this place. And now I can step through my test command by command. All right, let's see. So I can see what it really did. Let's try it again. Let me remove this and rerun this. So it goes up to pause, and now I can go command by command and see what has happened. Okay, so this is my advice. Write longer end-to-end tests. It's fine. They'll still be debuggable because you can see in a command log what has happened, and you can step through the test after the pause command. So if you are testing a piece of code or a component, it's called unit test. If you're going through the application, how the user is doing it, it's end-to-end test. Cypress has a whole guide to how you organize your test, what code you should have, in before each or before, right, compared to the test. So read the guide. Another thing is how do you actually organize the specs themselves, right? So everything is inside Cypress integration by default. Once you have a lot of tests, I usually try to split the longest specs, right? So the specs are all kind of like less than a minute long, I would say. And once you have bigger features, you probably have different user stories that sometimes exercise happy path, sometimes error handling. In that case, create subfolders, right? Just like we've done here. We have subfolders showing different aspects. So you can definitely organize specs by a feature. And you can even run all the feature specs using a path in Cypress, like right here. Right. So for example, like run all the adding items and then run all the specs. So there's no harm in using subfolders for your features. And also, if you split specs, you can run tests in parallel, which is faster. You can have a suite of tests and then have sub-suite of tests, so you can group them. And remember, every time you do something, an application updates itself, you probably want to add an assertion to make sure that the application really did what you expected to do, and that you're not blindly, really quickly, driving the app by clicking, typing, while the application still hasn't finished performing the very first action, right? This will lead to flake on CI, where the test goes very quickly and does a lot of things, but some things don't register because the application is still doing the first thing or the second thing and doesn't keep up with the test run. Okay, don't forget, you can always ask me questions in the chat, okay? So next thing, I want to quickly show you the Selector Playground. So Selector Playground. So I'm going to open this spec file, right? Notice that it has everything, right? It loads the test, and I'll just say only. And it doesn't recognize what you mean right here, right? How do we select, these items? Okay. Now, we don't even have, adding an item. So we need to find, how do we find this element, this input? So here's the trick. There is this thing, this target called Selector Playground. Once we click on it, it kind of looks like element selector in the DevTools. We can hover over everything in the app. And notice the title, right? So remember, we had very good selector, data-sci for this thing. So this element selector will suggest using that. If it doesn't have data-sci or data-test-id, it will go through the list of preferences according to the best practices. And it will say, well, the class, use new to do. So I can click on this new to do. And notice on the top, it says sci get class new to do. So you can just copy this, go back to your text and say type text plus enter. Nice. Okay. So we just kind of filled this thing. Oh, what about these items? Now here you have to be careful because it doesn't really do a good job with lists of items, right? So in this case, you probably want to say, hey, what is this label, right? No, this is just one element, right? So we don't Okay, 1 second. Okay, I think all good. Okay, so in this case, can everyone still see my screen, right? I assume. So in this case, we would still have to do like li to do something manual. Okay. So because this is just JavaScript, right? Let's say we don't want to. Let me just modify, right? So what if we add a class there, right? Or data attribute. Let's say data sci equals to do item. Okay. In that case, it's much better to use that than just class to do. Right. So let's see. So this data attribute should be here. Okay. So whenever we have an attribute, we can say data sci equals to do item. If you don't have a space, you don't have to quote it. Okay, that's good. But it's sometimes super long. If you have data test IDs or data sci for everything, it's very unwieldy to type this again and again. Because this is just JavaScript, we can say this. Okay, give me an ID and I'll form you a selector. So in this case, we can say, get me everything with data sci equal to do item. Okay. So this is what I suggest you do. Figure out a good strategy for marking every element you want to find on a page. Data sci, data test ID, something like that. Create a little utility function that will give you full selector so you don't have to think about it. And then every time you do get, just use that little function, right? You can move it into its own JavaScript file, right? So we can say export. And here you want to say import from utils. Works exactly the same way. And tomorrow we're gonna even make it better. We're gonna abstract this into a custom command. Okay. So Ilir, probably next I'll show how to deal with complex data. Everything depends on application, right? I'm answering the question from QA. You know, how do you control data if it's complex thing? You will see how we will use network stubbing to make sure we always start with fresh state, even without resetting the data. But this is the next two sections that talk about resetting the data and network stubbing. Okay. Okay. So one thing we've done, we've done the Selector Playground, right? It suggested us what it thought is a good thing, but sometimes it could be weird. It follows our best practices at Cypress, right? I've shown how to write little utility function. There is a new experimental studio, right? People have been asking us at Cypress to be able to record tests. So in Cypress JSON, I enabled studio. So what happens here is that if you hover over the name of a test, right, you have this command, right? So here, right, it can explain what to do, right? It can fail the test, but now we can, I believe, record what we want to do. So a new item. Okay. And notice it says studio commands now and another item. Okay. Oh, failing test. 1 second. Yeah, I cannot add items to the failing test. So what I will do here, I will ignore this. Okay, so let me add commands. Okay. So now I will interact with the app. So I will click here and I'll say A, B, B, B. Okay. So I interacted with my application and I can see those things being reflected here. So when I click save, right? So your mileage may vary. It's very hard to record everything accurately. So it's still experimental feature, but it's under active development. So hopefully you'll be able to record your interaction with the app, add assertions, and have a usable test. Okay, so this is Cypress Studio. By the way, you can add a very popular plugin to Cypress called Testing Library for Cypress, which will use the best practices for selecting elements using ARIA, role, and so on. So check out this library. You might find it very useful for working with elements. Okay, I want to quickly cover this last section for today, which is related to the question, how do you control the data? Okay, so every time a test leaves something like this, it might affect other tests that run after it. So we don't want to do that. But it's a problem, right? Because we don't know what to do. So let's switch to the next test, which is this one. So I have this test, adds 2 items. And I'm going to switch to the test right here. Okay. So this all works the first time and doesn't work the second time because they're already previously saved items. So what do we do? Well, where do we get those items? Well, the application is making a GET request to to-dos. They come from the server. Okay, so this is our test. We have to somehow clear the state. We have to tell our server, hey, I don't want to do anything. So our server, when it starts, it includes a special middleware. I can execute a post request to my server that's running at localhost 3000. I can say reset. And if I look at the server again, now it started from nothing. So my server in my particular application has a special endpoint where I can reset the data by giving it an empty list of to-dos. So what we have to do in our server is to perform a network request just like that. Okay, so we need to reset the database by making a network call, and then everything will be fine because the database will be empty. Now, here's a question. Do we do it before or after the visit? If we do it after, there is a race condition. What happens first, the application getting the data, or us resetting the data? So we have to do it before. Okay, so here's how we would do that. Right before we do this, we'll say sci request, which is a special. It's another command that allows you to do any kind of HTTP request. So we'll say post, and we'll say reset. And the object we're going to send is to-dos with just an empty list. Now, we could have used actual list of to-dos. In that case, we would reset database and say, here are 5 items I want to start with. But for now, let's just do this. Let's run it a couple times. notice, always passes, because every time before we visit, we say to a server, reset yourself. Okay, so after it's done that, right, it always returns an empty list, and we can confirm it by clicking on this get. Okay, so response from the server, always empty list. So we're always resetting the data. And by the way, we can also just click on this request, and it will show like what we sent to the server and what it responded with. So when you do site request, it's perfect for resetting the data, creating an item through API rather than through the UI, setting cookies, logging in. Site request can do cross-origin requests because it's a Cypress built-in command. It doesn't happen according to the restrictions. Okay. Another thing we could do, because the server saves everything into data JSON, is instead of doing reset, we can say site write file, and this is to do MVC data JSON, and what's inside the file, it's the same object. Okay, let's see if it works. And by the way, again, make sure you're writing the right file, right, by checking the file name written. Okay, and so now it's always passes. Okay, same thing. We can also use site task. So what I said, site task, the plugin file that we have in our project, it's kind of running in the background. So when Cypress runs, it starts this browser. It controls the browser, it loads its spec file, it has command log. But there is a process that actually starts the browser. It's a plugin process. It's a node process that runs in the background, where you can, for example, modify the list of browsers. You can modify the configuration. You can read process environment variables, all those little things that your application needs, right? So it's a separate process, but allows you to actually write reusable commands. Okay, for example, by registering on task reset data, okay, reset data just writes the file, because this plugin's process runs on node on your operating system. It doesn't run in the browser, so you can just use file system. You can reset your state by saying site task. Okay, so what was that? Reset data. Okay, and what's the data here? Data to set, it just writes a to file. So again, we'll just use the standard thing. Okay. So notice right here, we called site task with a name reset data, passed an argument. It returned, and this is the argument. It doesn't return anything, right? But we overwritten the file before we ran the test. And notice that in Cypress, every command runs one by one. It always waits for previous command to finish successfully before it starts. Okay, so you never have to worry about, oh, can I do visit after task? Do I have to use then? Do I use async await? No, everything is chained one by one automatically. Okay. So I explained site task, how to implement it. Okay. There is also another thing that's experimental, but every time you run a different spec right here, you can run some kind of background process automatically, and for example, like reset the data before each spec. Because when Cypress runs in Cypress Run mode, every spec becomes independent. So it runs one spec, closes the browser, opens the browser, runs the second spec, closes the browser, opens the browser, runs third spec. So that's why you can have those events where you can clean up the data before each spec, not before each test, but before each spec. So it's another avenue for you to control the data. Maybe you want to reset the database, truncate tables, and so on. So I want to finish in the next 5 minutes with an advice. There is a best practices guide for data, right? You do want to avoid tests relying on previous tests, right? Every test should be independent because it makes it so much easier to just say, run just this test, okay, by itself. So you want every test to set whatever it needs before, right? You also do not want the test to clean up, right? So here's why. So imagine you move a cleanup here, and you say, instead of this, I'm going to clean up here after each. Okay. Now, even if a test fails, after each will run. Okay. But what if the test run just crashes? What if your server crashes? What if your app completely bombs and the browser is not responsive, right? In that case, if everything goes terribly wrong, after each will never execute. So the next test will start from a dirty state, from dirty data. So it will never have a chance to actually do everything because it assumed previous test finished, correctly and cleaned up. So you can never make that assumption. So you don't want to use after each because even though, yes, it's guaranteed to run if a test fails, but if a test runner crashes, if a server crashes, then there is no guarantee that this actually will finish correctly. So our Cypress best practice is to always set up everything using before each. Not even using before because you want every test to be independent. Okay. There is a big presentation about that explains how Cypress controls the browser and how the plugin process runs and how they can communicate between the test and the plugin using exec. Okay, so watch this, right? And see any details that I don't have time to go into. Ilir is asking, in which situation is after each useful? I haven't found one yet. The only interesting one is code coverage. So there is a code coverage plugin. We're not going to use it in this basics workshop, but basically you can instrument your application and then use Cypress code coverage to generate a report that tells you which source lines in your application code have been covered. In order for that to save a code coverage accumulated from the test, after each test, it has to be saved, right? Because the new test will start from fresh. So that's the only place I actually used after each, and I thought it actually is necessary. I never saw normal kind of things in the real world where after each is useful. Okay. There are some advanced things for like reporting, but aside from that, nothing. Okay. So everyone, I want to thank you so much for listening to me. Hopefully you've been trying to code along, right? If not, then grab the repository, look at the content, look at each, spec file, right? And try to code as many tests as possible, right? There are a lot of situations that can be coded, right? And tomorrow we'll start again. And tomorrow we will, look at network. We will look at custom commands and running tests on CI. So it's going to be fun. So I'll see everyone tomorrow at the same time. Bring questions, because the more questions you ask, the better you will know Cypress. Take care.